Hello, health seekers. Welcome to another episode of the Keto Pro podcast with myself, Richard Smith. Today, I'm joined by the incredible Dr. Rachel Brown. Dr. Rachel Brown is a psychiatrist, a metabolic psychiatrist, in fact, and I believe the only one currently in the UK. Rachel, is that correct?
Um, Possibly. I don't know. I think there may be some people in London, but I don't know a huge amount about them.
But you are number one, at least. You are number one.
Thank you. I'll take that.
Anyway, welcome on board.
Thank you. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while, so it's good to
Yes,
be here.
me too. Apologies. It's taken a long time to get you on and get everything aligned to free up your time and mine. But you're here. Fantastic. Could you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a psychiatrist. I've been working in psychiatry for 20 years now, which is a bit mind-blowing, but anyway, that's the truth. And I've had a long-standing interest in holistic health and particularly nutrition and diet, just from my teenage years probably. And I've been on my own health journey over the years and latterly trained with Dr. Georgia Eid in 2021. And I also trained in functional medicine during 2020 when hospitals were pretty quiet. And yeah, where I am now is that I offer, and I've managed to start a metabolic psychiatry clinic within the NHS, but I also do some private work now as well, more along a metabolic psychiatry or functional medicine perspective, helping people overcome usually long-standing mental health symptoms that haven't necessarily improved despite all the standard approaches to treatment.
Fantastic. So, for the sake of the listeners, could you explain a little bit about metabolic psychiatry and why it differs to the standard approach?
Yeah, sure. So the standard approach, or the way I was trained in allopathic medicine, which is just Western medicine really, um, was you take a history, you make a diagnosis, and a diagnosis is just a group of symptoms. And within psychiatry, often a lot of diagnoses overlap with each other, so you have symptoms in common, and it's not unusual to see several different psychiatrists, and you might receive several different opinions on your diagnosis. And people often are diagnosed with more than one mental disorder using that classification system. But usually that's to target drug treatment, so pharmaceutical treatment of mental health symptoms, whereas a metabolic approach takes into account somebody's nutrition, history, and their metabolic health. And when I talk about metabolic health, we're really talking about whether somebody might have pre-diabetes or may have lived with high levels of insulin for many years and have metabolic dysfunction, which you'll know is so common these days. It's unreal. And metabolic psychiatry differs because you have more natural ways of approaching treatment with somebody, so you can actually use changes to diet and dietary strategies to have quite profound improvements in mental health, including improvements in severe mental illness. So what we would refer to as chronic and enduring mental disorders, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, those kind of issues.
Yeah, incredible. I mean, there's the evidence towards dietary intervention with mental health is incredible, isn't it? I mean, the ketogenic diet approach, for example, is shown to I can't remember the percentage, but it was a high percent, maybe in the 60% reversal, I think, or at least improvement in most cases in regards to schizophrenia. I mean, this is incredible because the approach is usually a medicinal approach, isn't it? It's medication, and I'm not against medication. I think medication's fantastic. We've seen some incredible advancements over the last few years in regards to the medication on the market. If it wasn't for medication, at some point in my life, I'd be dead. But I'm always a big believer in the body wants to heal and repair.
Mhm.
But generally the whole approach of diet being an intervention is sort of it's usually pushed to one side, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
But to me, it makes perfect sense. What you put in is what you get out. How can the diet? I mean, you've mentioned insulin resistance. for the sake of the listeners, can you explain a little bit in regards to what would cause insulin resistance and inflammation?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I immediately think of type 2 diabetes. So often the difficulty these days is that we're not doing the right blood tests to pick people up early enough to catch a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes before it actually becomes manifest and obvious. So often people are living with high levels of insulin for many, many years. It could be a decade or even longer. And we tend to just check a fasting glucose level, and your glucose only starts to rise when your insulin signaling in the body fails. So having a high level of insulin for many, many years, eventually what happens is it just tips the body over the edge and you develop frank insulin resistance, where essentially the insulin isn't able to function properly. And your brain needs energy to run like any other organ of the body. And if you have an insulin resistant brain, then your brain cells can't access the energy from glucose. And this causes all sorts of mental health symptoms. So there's a huge amount of research in relation to dementia, specifically Alzheimer's. But actually, if you take a root cause view of what causes mental health symptoms, then an energy impairment or dysfunction in the brain could cause any sort of mental health symptom. And type 2 diabetes is known as end stage insulin resistance. So that's why I often think of that immediately when we're talking about insulin resistance. But it's possible for people to be insulin resistant to varying degrees for quite some time before their blood glucose ever starts to rise and they receive a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. And the other thing is that we often associate type 2 diabetes with metabolic syndrome, where somebody might be very overweight and have high blood pressure. But actually, it's possible to be insulin resistant and have high levels of insulin, even if you're thin on the outside. And sometimes that's referred to as TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. So yeah, there's some really interesting research by Dr. Cynthia Culkin that showed in people with symptoms of severe mental disorder who had maybe once responded to treatment at some time in the past, but over time their symptoms had become more persistent and less responsive to standard medications. They were able to show that from the cohort of people they tested, that all of the people with insulin resistance had problems with their blood-brain barrier, which would be the main protective mechanism for the brain. And once they were able to reverse the insulin resistance, these people saw improvements in their mental health symptoms and started responding to standard medications again. So really, really interesting connections there.
Yeah, it is super interesting. And I think, we could go down a rabbit hole with this in regards to why, ketones can help with this and so on. But if we take a step back and look at so insulin resistance, what would cause someone to
Oh.
become insulin resistant in the first place?
Well, usually it's eating too much carbohydrate, although the other factor can be too many seed oils or inflammatory omega-6 fatty acids in the diet. And we know that having a highly processed food rich diet, you're naturally going to be taking in a lot of seed oils, which are inflammatory for the brain, but also cause metabolic issues in and of themselves. But I think for a lot of people, it's a combination of those inflammatory seed oils that just shouldn't be in the diet, and also just far too much carbohydrate, because every time you eat carbs, your body releases insulin because it's really toxic to have high blood glucose levels, and that's why your body releases insulin to bring your blood glucose down again. And if you're eating carbs, especially if you're eating 5 or 6 times a day, as we've often been told to eat, then you're just going to be constantly producing more and more insulin. And over time, you are hyperinsulinemic, so you have high levels of insulin, and that's what causes the issue.
Yeah. And I think it's important for the listeners to understand there that carbs break down into sugar, into glucose. So if we, quite often, I work with a client who will come to me and say that, I don't eat any sugar. I don't eat sugar. I don't put sugar in my tea or my coffee. To which my next question is, what do you eat for breakfast? Oh, a bowl of muesli.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of people don't understand that carbs break down into sugar. Carbs is sugar,
Yeah.
effectively, and we need to understand that they are one and the same. Too many carbohydrates from dietary perspective is going to as you say, require insulin because glucose in the blood to a certain level is toxic. And
Hmm.
this is the reason that we pull the glucose out of the blood. But it's interesting you mentioned the seed oils. I mean, we're told that seed oils are heart healthy. We're told that they're good for us and they lower cholesterol. And we can get into this as we go. But seed oils are man-made, aren't they? They were made by industry to fuel tanks and ships during the world wars, and then they created an industry to continue that market. But seed
Hmm.
oils, they are toxic compounds that are treated with chemicals like hexane and bleached with peroxide. If and they don't come from vegetables, they come from
No.
seeds. So to extract that oil, we use hexane and then quite literally hair dye peroxide to give it that golden glow. Um, and I think as a percentage, some studies that I've looked at previously show that the consumption, because of our volume of seed oils, this actually contributes to more insulin resistance, potentially from a caloric perspective than carbohydrate. Um, but they're found in everything in the supermarket.
Everything.
Everything in the supermarket, everything in that shiny packet contains a high volume of carbohydrate and a high level of these toxic vegetable oils, high in oxidized omega-6s. So it's almost a perfect storm, isn't it? You
Oh
know?
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I trained with Dr. Georgia Eid a few years ago, but I had the pleasure of actually meeting her in person when she spoke at a meeting in Sheffield last year. And my take-home message from her talk that day was that these inflammatory seed oils, the linoleic acid, so the omega-6 portion of the fat, can actually cross the blood-brain barrier, get into the brain, and then your brain burns this stuff. So it oxidizes it, and it shouldn't really, and that causes something called oxidative stress in the brain, which is directly linked to inflammation. And so the brain as an organ is relatively deficient in antioxidants. So it doesn't have many antioxidant defenses. So if you're piling in seed oils and your ratio of omega-6 is really high and that's getting into your brain, it just causes chaos essentially. And that's what can tip neurotransmitter pathways out of balance. Even though I don't think that's the main reason people become unwell from a mental health perspective, it's still a factor in the many reasons that that can happen.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's yeah, the vegetable oils I think are incredibly misunderstood. As you know, we're told that these are incredibly good for the heart, but one of the things that I mentioned during the conference we were at recently, the Keto Brain Health, was a condition called cytosterolemia, which basically shows that this can increase risk of cardiovascular disease by quite some amount because of the phytosterols, the plant sterols found within the vegetable oils. They compete, or they artificially lower our cholesterol. Now, cholesterol is imperative. It's not something that we want to be artificially lowering, and by doing so, can lead to increased risk of heart disease and mental illness. So, I mean, cholesterol is essential for life. Um,
Agreed.
why is it so important for the brain?
Because the brain is loaded with cholesterol, and also if you think about even the nerves, they're surrounded by myelin sheaths, and those myelin sheaths are all made up of cholesterol, which is why it always fills me with horror when I hear about people with multiple sclerosis being advised to take statins, for example, to lower their cholesterol level, because that just doesn't really intuitively make much sense to me from a logical point of view. And yeah, I think yeah, there can be complications when you artificially lower cholesterol in relation to memory and cognitive abilities. So I don't think there's any doubts there, that cholesterol is incredibly important.
Yeah, super important. I mean, it's essential for cell formation, cell communication, nutrient absorption, nutrient transportation, the production of hormones, and it's
Mhm.
essential for healing. And as you say, the myelin sheath in the brain, every cell in the body needs
Yeah.
cholesterol. What would you say to the listeners in regards to some of the foods that maybe we're told to avoid, such as your butter, your tallow, lard, ghee, and things like red meat that are supposedly high in saturated fats? Well, red meat actually isn't, but
No,
anyway,
I
that's probably
know.
that's probably a talk for another day. Um, but what would you say to the listeners who are concerned about consuming these compounds?
So that those list of fats that you just mentioned there, they're all natural fats and ancestrally appropriate for us to eat in terms of how we've evolved over the years and what our ancestors would have been eating. So people would have been hunting. Red meat's the most nutrient dense, rich source of nutrition. There are so many compounds within red meat that are helpful in terms of brain health. So there are certain peptides, so protein molecules like carnosine and carnitine that actually lower oxidative stress in the brain and at the level of the nerves. And they're, of course, full of vital nutrients such as vitamins and minerals. And there are just so many benefits to eating those, including red meat as such as a core part of the diet. And also those fats you mentioned, they're all relatively stable fats in terms of cooking, which can be another issue if people are using polyunsaturated fats, which are inherently unstable when heated.
Yeah, fantastic. So how would you compare those nutrients that you just mentioned from the animal proteins to the compounds that we can obtain, or can we even obtain from plant compounds?
I don't think we can obtain those from plant compounds. So I often have Anthony Chaffee pop into my head when I'm thinking about this, but a purely plant-based diet cannot provide all the nutrients that we need for good health. And I think we see this. So I certainly see quite a few patients coming through the service in the NHS who are vegan these days. And often those are the people that stick in my mind who tend to have been riddled with very long-standing mental health symptoms. And I usually try to speak to people about that, but not everybody's receptive to hearing about that issue. But I would have major concerns about somebody following a vegan diet or a purely plant-based diet if they are suffering from mental health symptoms.
Yeah, I agree. And it's a difficult subject. I mean, I believe that people come into this, into becoming a vegan or vegetarian for the right reasons. It's
Mhm.
for the planet, for, animal protection and cruelty and for health and well-being. But, I truly believe that implementing an animal-based diet is the best way to combat all of these. And again, this is probably a talk for another day, but coming back to the nutrients, the creatine, choline, carnitine, carnosine, all compounds that we can't obtain from plants, vitamin B12 and iron, so on and so forth. And these are all cofactors that are involved, and you touch base on the neurotransmitters. And again, I agree, as you rightly say, that they are a contributing factor. They're not the be all and end all, but certainly a contributing factor, because if we can't create our neurotransmitters, then it's going to lead to issues downstream to that. But in order to create our neurotransmitters, we need cofactors:
Mhm.
zinc, iron, magnesium, vitamin B3, B6, B12, and so on and so forth. And if we consume a plant-based lifestyle over a meat-based, then the anti-nutrients within those plants can prevent the absorption of the nutrients that are in there. So what type of life, when someone comes to see you, and they are susceptible and open to suggestion in regards to dietary change, what sort of protocol would you recommend? What would you put them on? Would you recommend a full change in diet for everyone? Is there different recommendations for each person, or are there stages of incremental changes?
Yeah, it depends really on the person's individual situation. So a lot of people I see in the NHS, I work in a crisis service. So often I'm seeing people at their worst possible point in time. So a lot of people who are acutely suicidal, or they may be acutely psychotic or severely depressed or manic. And so there's a bit of nuance in those situations around whether somebody can actually make the decision to undertake a big lifestyle change. And sometimes it's about picking the right time. So quite often I leave information with them to think about this at a later point in time and hope that they'll come back to me to discuss it more. Um, I I struggle to think of a situation where somebody couldn't potentially be helped by trying a ketogenic diet specifically, just because of the potent anti-inflammatory effects that those have. Neurodegenerative disorders are so problematic these days as well, and I suppose often they include the brain as well by virtue of what they are. So like Parkinson's disease and ALS and dementia and all sorts, even Huntington's disease. all of those conditions can be benefited by being in nutritional ketosis. So it's very difficult to think of a reason where somebody really shouldn't be trying that unless there are a few specific contraindications, very rare genetic disorders, but usually somebody would be aware if they had one of those. I think for very autoimmune type people, so people who've had autoimmune illnesses for a long time, then for some of those people, it might be better to take more of a carnivore approach than keto, just because of the plant anti-nutrients that you'd mentioned previously. And with carnivore being the ultimate elimination diet. And what we're really trying to do is heal the gut, because there's this gut-brain connection, and we know that a lot of our neurotransmitters, the vast majority, are produced in the gut by the bacteria that reside there. And gut health is just absolutely paramount when it comes to mental health as well. I tend to speak to people about whether they are abstainers or moderators. So some people do better taking a slower approach to implementing a ketogenic diet, and others just want to dive in head first, being abstainers. They find it easy to eliminate all of the carb immediately and just dive head first into a ketogenic diet. But for some people, it can be helpful to switch over more gradually. So for some people, I would say change one meal in a day, and then maybe a week later, if you're doing okay with that meal, try changing the next meal over. And on the third week, you can then change the final meal if you're doing 3 meals a day, to be ketogenic. So yeah, it really depends on an individual's personal situation. And I'm not a huge, some people would disagree with this, but I'm not a huge tracker of macros. So I've trained in the different medical ketogenic diets that you can offer people, ranging from like a 1-to-1 ratio of macros up to a 4-to-1, where you'd have 4 times the amount of fat versus one amount of your protein and carb combined. But actually, my approach tends to be about making it intuitive for people and people educating themselves on what foods they can include, what they should exclude, and then just building up a repertoire of meals and food options that they can feel comfortable with and just naturally go to without having to necessarily calculate macros and have spreadsheets or use apps. But if somebody wants to do that, then that's absolutely fine by me as well. And having said that, I've had a few people who've meticulously tracked everything, and it makes it so much easier for me when they come to see me in the clinic. But yeah, I'd rather if people were intuitive about it.
Yeah, I agree. I've done both, and I've worked with clients who, there's some clients don't like to track. I find it can make or break a new lifestyle. Some people like to track, and for others who don't, when they miss a meal, it's almost, oh, I've missed tracking now, I may as well throw the towel in. So
Oh.
I tend to do the same. I try to teach intuitive eating. It's interesting in regards to your approach in regards to changing one meal. I implement a similar approach when people come to me from, a standard lifestyle or a standard way of eating. I remove one thing each week. So week one, I'd remove the grains, for example, so that person can eat whatever they want other than the grains. So they abstain from grains. And grains is something that I want to get into, once we've gone past this, because grains, in my opinion, are detrimental, especially for mental health, for a number of reasons. Week two would be abstaining from the vegetable oils. So actively removing any vegetable oil from cooking, and making sure that you are checking any packets of things that you're consuming in the supermarket to make sure that they're vegetable oil free. And then so on and so forth. So it would be a stage of incremental changes. In fact, reducing the carbohydrate doesn't come in for me until week 4. Because I believe by default, reducing or removing the grains contributes to a lot of the carbohydrate anyway. The grains, as I said, I believe to be absolutely detrimental. The seed oils, which are probably worse, once you've taken them out in week 2. So all of the benefits, I believe, come from, greatly from those two levers that we pull. And then learning and understanding about, the impacts of carbohydrate. And then, further down the line would be the importance of the proteins and fats and why, these are actually essential. So yeah, I agree. I think it's, incremental change works for many people. And even within you mentioned abstainers and what was the other one? Sorry, abstainers,
Moderators.
moderators. That's it.
Yeah.
So I always, what do I call it? Incremental change and step change. So that's what I.
Okay.
So incremental change, obviously increments, and step change is just in one go.
Yeah.
But what I find, like I'm a step change person, so
Oh my.
it
Mhm.
either needs to be all gone or not. But even though I'm step change, it's taken incremental changes for me to become carnivore, which is
Oh.
so I've removed it was lowering the carb in the first place, so I was abstaining from carb, but then I became educated in the way of the vegetable oils. So even though I was removing them, it was done incrementally. And then when I began my ketogenic journey, I predominated vegetables. So I was more of a vegetable based ketonian, if you like. So I was eating my kale and spinach and broccoli with turmeric and black pepper. And it's I was way healthier by doing that than I was
Yeah. Oh,
previously
I'm sure. Yeah.
because and in spite of, not because of, but it's because I was removing much of the toxic compounds that existed in my diet prior to that.
Mhm.
um I was now producing ketones, which I want to get into as we go along with this, because there's massive benefits to being ketogenic. I think what you've said so far, Rachel, is lowering the carbohydrate, removing the seed oil. That's going to see a huge benefit. And then, so that's low carb. The next step would be becoming ketogenic, producing ketones for various reasons. So is that safe to say so far? I mean, low carb
Yeah.
approach is beneficial, and then
Yeah.
ketogenic. So if somebody were to be contemplating the transition from low carb into a ketogenic state, how would they do this, and why would they further benefit for being in a ketogenic state?
So the how, I tend to the number of grams of carbohydrate that any individual can tolerate does vary from person to person. But I tend to give people a ballpark figure of going down to 20 grams of carb per day just to make sure they definitely get into ketosis. Sometimes, unfortunately, some psychiatric medications can make that a bit harder because there are certain groups of medicines that cause insulin resistance. But usually, the vast majority of people can get into ketosis. Sorry, what was the other part of your question?
The benefits. Why would
Oh, yeah.
somebody? So I mean, it's so basically, first of all, let's explain what ketosis is, because it sounds incredibly scary, doesn't it? I mean, it sounds like something you don't want. But this is highly beneficial.
Oh,
So
yeah.
could
I
you
mean,
explain?
I think it's our natural state because babies are born in ketosis, and when they're breastfeeding, they're often spending a lot of their time in ketosis. And so the assumption being that it must be incredibly important for brain development to have ketone bodies on board. And actually, when you look at it, ketone bodies are a cleaner fuel source than glucose is for the brain. And also, they provide more energy per unit than glucose does for the brain. But they also just have vast and very profound anti-inflammatory effects throughout the body. So not just in the brain, but elsewhere as well. And they can do things such as turning off parts of the immune system that become activated when you're in an inflammatory state. So the NLRP3 inflammasome, and there's all sorts of, fancy detail involved in that. But there's just so many benefits, profound benefits to ketones. And I think often the scary bit comes from a misunderstanding of diabetic ketoacidosis. And sadly, a lot of the medical profession often confuse the terms because, in my experience, most doctors aren't familiar, unless they have a specific interest, most aren't familiar with nutritional ketosis. But the body produces ketones when you lower your carbohydrate intake enough that it has to switch over from burning glucose as its main fuel source to burning ketone bodies. And they're simply fat breakdown products that have all these wonderful benefits that I just mentioned.
Yeah, which are, we can go on and on in regards to the benefits, but I mean, it comes back to what you are, a metabolic psychiatrist, isn't it? So it's a metabolic state. We can be in the metabolic state of glycolysis where we can burn glucose, or we can be in the metabolic state of ketosis where we burn fat for fuel and produce ketones. Um, during your talk at Keto Brain Health, I mean, you went into a bit of detail in regards to a number of things, glutamate and GABA, which is one, BDNF is another. Um, can we get into that and the benefits and as to and I believe that these are big reasons why
Yeah.
living a ketogenic lifestyle can have profound results on any mental
Yes.
health, or anxiety, depression. As you know from our talks previously, I used to suffer severely with anxiety and depression,
Mhm.
to the point that I would find it difficult to leave my house. And I put it down to, at least from the biggest portion of what I've done, is the production of ketones.
Mhm.
And I truly believe that, yes, I've removed some toxic compounds, but ketones have allowed me to overcome something that was absolutely debilitating. Um, can you explain a little bit
Yeah.
about? Fantastic.
Sure. So yeah, the tryptophan pathway, which is the glutamate and GABA issue, under conditions of non-inflammation, so if you don't have inflammation on board, that pathway functions and operates, and you really want to be having a good balance between your GABA, which is the relaxation neurotransmitter, versus your glutamate, which is the excitatory neurotransmitter. But what happens under conditions of inflammation is that this pathway gets tipped out of balance, and more tryptophan essentially gets shunted down the pathway to produce glutamate. And you can end up with hundreds of times, I don't know what the best way to say it, but levels of glutamate that's hundreds of times higher than it should be. And then you get into a condition called glutamatergic excitotoxicity. So basically, your brain is overstimulated and inflamed because of these products that are produced down this pathway. And you don't have enough GABA to try and counteract or balance the glutamate. And GABA is the neurotransmitter that drugs like benzodiazepines work on. So they work to sort of boost GABA, and that's why they can have an anti-anxiety effect. And this is this sort of situation when you've got too much glutamate on board is the perfect storm for experiencing symptoms of anxiety, potentially very severe, but also cognitive symptoms. And I would argue any mood symptoms, psychotic symptoms, anything really to do with mental health. But also all the chronic neurodegenerative conditions are also, there's lots of research out there showing that Parkinson's disease and other neurodegenerative disorders are also linked to these high levels of glutamate. And that's why when you have ketone bodies on board, they help to reduce inflammation. And this allows the balance to be restored between GABA and brings glutamate down. So that's just one example of the benefits it can have for brain health and mental health.
Yeah,
Um,
it's incredible.
I've, I've forgotten
Sorry.
now what was the other thing you mentioned.
What else was there? Yeah, the
Oh, it was BDNF,
BDNF. Yeah.
I think. Yeah, so gosh, so many mental health disorders, especially depression and anxiety, are associated with not having enough brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And it's probably not technically correct, but I often think about BDNF as being the fertilizer for the brain. So it's really essential um, for neurotransmission, so the communication in your brain, but also for nerve proliferation, development, everything really, just maintaining that ever so delicate balance of how the brain is structured and functioning. And ketone bodies or being in nutritional ketosis has been shown to raise or boost levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor as well.
Yeah. So many things that, I mean, we could get into there in regards to, and not to mention, I mean, you mentioned earlier about energy to the brain, and ketones in the form of beta hydroxybutyrate can breach the blood-brain barrier when glucose can't. I mean, and you mentioned earlier that the brain could quite literally be swimming in a sea of glucose, but unable to access that for energy.
Yeah.
Um, and you also made an important fact that, there are cells in the body that do need glucose. The erythrocyte red blood cell, the glutaminergic neurotransmitters in the brain, they still use GLUT4 transporters. So we do need glucose. And the best way to allow us to do this, isn't it, is by blocking all those pathways that you mentioned, NLRP3, inflammasome, correcting the inflammation and insulin resistance and allowing the body and the brain to function the way that it should. But I mean, it's a minefield of information. And you mentioned, the kynurenine pathway, which is the tryptophan pathway, and so on and so forth. But in simplistic terms, I think the way to look at ketones is that it lowers inflammation, corrects insulin resistance, and fuels the brain.
Yeah.
It's as well as everything else in the body, but
Mm.
and we haven't even mentioned and got into NAD plus to NADH and the electron transport chain. But so ketones are fantastic. So it's, and this is why we live, a ketogenic and carnivore based lifestyle, isn't it? To produce these ketones. Why would one, I mean, we mentioned grains or cereals and breads earlier in regards to the carbohydrate impact, but are there any other reasons why, wheat germ agglutinin, for example, could be problematic to mental health?
Well, yeah, so wheat in particular, the protein component of it interacts with the gut lining, and so it opens up the tight junctions in our gut wall. So it gives you leaky gut or increased intestinal permeability. And what that sets the stage for is for immune system activation, because if you have bacterial toxins in the gut that leak across your gut wall barrier and into your bloodstream, this is what can set off an immune system reaction. And when your immune system is activated, we have immune cells in our brain called microglia. So they also become activated and then are expressed in an inflammatory state instead of an anti-inflammatory state. And this also causes chaos in terms of mental health and inflammation in the brain. And that's why, yeah, just gut health is so incredibly important for mental health, brain health.
Yeah, and it's incredible. I mean, there is a huge connection, isn't it? The gut-brain axis.
Mm.
And I think that there have been published studies which have shown that wheat germ agglutinin has been known to travel up the vagus nerve via this, this
Okay.
connection, isn't it? And cause neurological problems. I think there was quite a large percentage of recoveries from things like, or improvements with patients with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's when they underwent a surgery called a vagotomy. So they had the vagus nerve cut. And that's got to be proof positive that
You
grains,
think.
yeah, they're
And
highly,
lectins, I think lectins behave in a similar way and can travel up the vagus nerve. And there have been some interesting papers in relation to Parkinson's disease from lectins. So yeah,
yeah.
interesting.
And there, we speak about lectins, gluten, we know is a lectin, wheat germ agglutinin, so on and so forth. But vegetables contain lectins.
Mm.
Meats contain lectins, but the lectins in meat don't seem to be problematic. They work differently within the body, but lectins from plants in the form of phytohemagglutinin, for example, I haven't seen any studies to say that they travel the vagus nerve. But if wheat germ, and other lectins from grains are able to do that, then it should suggest that phytohemagglutinin could do the same. But phytohemagglutinin can still cause that intestinal permeability.
Yeah.
So it's compounds which are high in things like this are things that we would use as a staple on a ketogenic lifestyle, such
Mm.
as tomatoes and bell peppers, even cauliflower, for example. So it's and it comes back, I think, to this the type of person that you are, in regards to these changes. And as you rightly say, if you suffer severely with autoimmune issues, maybe the route towards carnivore may be more beneficial to heal that gut.
Yeah.
Would you how often would you recommend somebody gravitate into a more carnivore based lifestyle over ketogenic, or would it generally be through these incremental changes? Does it depend on where they are in regards to the damage?
I think it depends where they're starting from as well. So I know some people, I worry sometimes about going straight to carnivore because it's so mind-blowing, I think, for some people to even contemplate that. So I worry that some people would just would put them off doing keto entirely if they thought they would have to be as strict as being carnivore. But yeah, it's usually the autoimmune people or I've known people with major mental health symptoms who also have inflammatory bowel disease, and those would be the people I'd de most definitely be suggesting they look into carnivore. Because I know there's been a lot of success within the carnivore community at reversing inflammatory bowel disease, such as Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, using a carnivore approach. And some of those people were people on the verge of doing immunotherapy and experimental treatments. They were quite far down the line in terms of treatment, standard treatments that are on offer for treatment of inflammatory bowel disease. And
Yeah.
the rates of IBD are much higher in cohorts with depression as well, which just makes complete sense if you think about the whole gut-brain connection.
Yeah, it's all connected, isn't it? It's
Mhm. Yeah.
everything is connected, and it comes back to what we put into our mouth.
Mhm.
If we look at what the human body's made of, if we were to look at the cell, the average mammalian cell, for example, it predominates water, but let's move the water out of the way. If we were to look from a macronutrient perspective, if the weight of each cell, around 18% of the weight of the cell minus the water. So we're left with 30% because 70% is water. So it predominates protein, then it drops down to lipid, and it drops right down to carbohydrate or polysaccharide, which means our body's made of protein and fat. So
Mhm.
it makes sense to predominate protein and fat.
Yeah.
Yet, from a standard, perspective of consuming food, the eat well plate, the food pyramid, they predominate carbohydrate, and from grains, which
You're-
as you just said, are highly problematic.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, grains today are not what they once were.
Yeah.
They've been heavily hybridized and genetically modified to produce higher yields. Would you say that it's still safe to consume maybe ancient grains in the form of, the sourdough rise and things, or is it best just to remove um, all forms of grain, at least in the beginning, or is it something that maybe we can put back in once we've healed the gut to a certain degree?
Um, I struggle with my own biases here, but I would prefer people didn't include those certainly routinely in their diet. But I certainly think there's potential for some people once they've healed that they might be able to have that now and again. But I probably wouldn't center the whole diet around those ancient grains purely because of the carbohydrate content. Yeah, that would be my take, but I don't know what yours would be on
I
that.
agree. Yeah, I agree. I think, I've worked with clients who have relied on them. And they've been a crutch, so they have been a tool, but they're still heavily problematic. These compounds are still heavily problematic. In an ideal world, I mean, these are not things that we would have consumed, I believe, during our evolutionary period. It's only in modern times have these been introduced through farming and agriculture. I don't believe that we would have relied on them, from an evolutionary perspective. I think vegetables in general are not what they once were. The vegetables we see today are not what they once were. And you and I are based in the UK. If we look at fruit, for example, we wouldn't have had bananas, and these huge oranges, we crab apples, which are absolutely tiny and quite sour. So, you wouldn't eat an awful lot of them. And berries, which
Yeah.
again, are the lowest in carbohydrate. I believe we would have consumed these during our evolutionary period, but they would have been locally sourced.
Mhm.
So they would have been seasonal and locally sourced. I don't consume any, vegetable or fruit any longer. I'm not against those who do, but I would always err on the side of caution, especially when healing. In the initial phase, I think the stricter we can be, the better. But I do also believe that we can achieve this via incremental changes, and I think you're right. It comes down to the individual, what type of person they are. So, and I think that's a skill because you probably get the same. Somebody will come to you, I'll do whatever you say, and that they, and I've believed this, and I've
Mhm.
given people a protocol to follow. 2 days later, I can't, it's too difficult, I'm thrown in the towel. And then you try to say, well, let's take it back a step, but the damage is already done.
Yeah.
So um it's difficult, and it's a skill to understand which client you work with is going to be better suited to which protocol.
Mhm.
But yeah, I agree. I think sourdough rye, ancient grains, we're better. We are better, far better without them. What what sort of protocol would talk me through, like a standard day of eating, for example, for someone who has just come to see you. Um, they are suffering with anxiety and depression. They want to make better changes. They're not on medication yet. Um, what sort of protocol, would you send them down? How many times a day would they eat? And again, we're not tracking because we don't want to track, but what
Yeah.
what would we try to get them to put onto their plate throughout that day?
Yeah, so most people in my experience are usually eating 3 meals a day or more in terms of snacking. So I quite often start at 3 meals a day. I don't tend to be too prescriptive, so I give people a food list and ask them to pick out what foods they actually enjoy off that list and then to have a think for themselves about what they would use which meals, but an example of a good meal. And I'm generally supportive of people eating breakfast because that's really helpful in terms of our circadian rhythms. But like eggs are a perfect food if people like those. Quite an inexpensive form of high quality protein and nutrients. Lots of choline in the egg yolks for your brain function, your cognitive function. And they're so versatile because they can be made in so many different ways. So that can provide quite a lot of variety on a ketogenic diet. But if people want to eat bacon, I know a lot of people eat avocado, which isn't necessarily local or seasonal, but that can be helpful for some people to get enough fat and to transition to a ketogenic diet. And then for lunch or dinner, just centering around ideally if they can get local regenerative type meat, but I know that's not within everybody's budget. But picking a form of protein, preferably a fatty protein, so fatty meat of some sort. And if they want to include some sort of low carb vegetable or berries on the side, they could do that. And then similar for dinner, really. So trying to keep carbs 20 grams or below. And yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I've been carnivore for over 5 years now, and even I'm finding that even now I've sort of lost a lot of my keto repertoire of meals that I would have been making day in and day out because I just think very simply now about about fatty meat being the centerpiece.
Yeah, snap. It sounds incredibly boring, but my typical day of eating is a plate full of steak or lamb, or a combination of the two. But again, I agree. I tend to edge towards the fattier cuts,
Yeah.
and I think it's one of the the limiting factors for many people is um, cash or
Yeah.
cost. But it's easy to find low cost meats that are high quality in mince meat, for example, or ground beef for our friends
Yeah.
the other side of the pond. Incredibly cheap. If you can befriend a local butcher, they can make the ground beef or mince with organ meats like liver,
Mhm.
heart, kidney, so on. So I tend to get like a 90 to 10% mix. So it's
Mhm.
90% mince with 10%
Oh, that's too lean for me.
this. So not in fat, 90% of the chuck steak.
Oh,
So
okay.
they mince chuck, which is one of the fattier cuts, but it's
Okay.
90% mince, but 10% organ meats.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I was thinking 90-10. Yeah, fat, protein to fat. Okay.
Yeah. So
Okay.
chuck is that is something that is my go-to. I don't know if you eat a lot of chuck, but chuck is the end of the ribeye.
Yeah, I have.
So
Yeah. Yeah,
chuck
it's
is one of
great
my
and
yeah.
cost effective in comparison to ribeye anyway. I don't know anyone who could live on ribeyes all the time.
Exactly. And I think when we look at from the American perspective, it's always ribeye.
Mm.
But ribeye's expensive. I can't afford ribeye. And I wouldn't want fillet because it's too lean. But chuck is
Yeah, same.
incredibly cheap. It's half the price of rump. So I mean,
Mhm.
there are things that you can do. And if you befriend your local butcher and buy in bulk, then you can usually
Yeah.
get these, a lot easier. So we're recommending 3 meals a day, basically, predominant animal proteins and natural fats
Yeah.
with preferably seasonal vegetables and fruits in.
Mhm.
So what sort of proportion on the plate for somebody who's new to this would we predominate with animal proteins from a visual perspective? Because we're told to make our plate full of vegetables,
Yeah.
and then the protein takes up a small portion of that plate. But how would you recommend we do that from a visual perspective? Ideally, just meat, I know.
Yeah, yeah.
But
I was thinking the whole plate full of meat. That's what I was thinking. Um, yeah, I don't tend to talk to people in those kind of ways. I know you do, and that can be really helpful. I what I try to encourage is that people are go by their appetite and that they try out different types of meals to see what actually they need to eat to be satiated until the following meal. So I think that can vary quite a lot between men and women and different ages and activity levels. But I don't know what you would say in terms of proportion of the plate.
yeah, look, I agree. That's all that I put on my plate is animal proteins. Everything in nature comes with fat. So, nature provides us with this perfectly packaged present. A piece of protein comes with fat. And if you aim for, as you say, the fattier cuts in general, then we've got both bases covered. ideally no veg, but what I tell people is, 1/4 of your plate to be, vegetables, for example, if you are putting them on there. But there is no benefit to consuming them, and I genuinely believe that there's no nutritional benefit. In fact, there's only negatives to come from adding those in. But some people, as you say, it's too much of a big step to gravitate into becoming full carnivore. So if they feel the need to do that, then I try to build 3/4 of their plate minimum with animal proteins
Okay.
from a visual perspective.
Yeah,
Um,
I think it's such a psychological hurdle for people to, after years and years of conditioning in the media and from government guidelines and eat well guidelines about eating the rainbow and there's so much that goes into all of this in terms of how people feel when they're trying to make this change because most people, I suspect you'll agree, if you put a picture of a plate of meat in front of them and ask them, is that healthy or unhealthy? Most people are going to say it's unhealthy based on conditioning that we've had societally, from a society point of view for many, many years. And I always think knowledge is power. So it's about trying to understand. And that's why these conversations are so useful as to what nutrition is fundamental for optimal human health and how we've evolved over the years and what's appropriate from an ancestral point of view in terms of interaction of the environment with our genes. And when you start to pool all of that information together, it should change your perspective on what looks healthy on a plate. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I agree. And you mentioned, genes and genetics there. We can't change our genome, but we can express it
Mhm.
epigenetically,
Yeah.
which is something, you mentioned, and something my talk was about predominantly during, the keto brain health, that we can express certain pathways and elicit certain actions to express our genes or our DNA in simplistic
Yeah.
terms for benefit. Um, I'm conscious of your time, Rachel. Have you got to shoot anything? Or have you got another 5 minutes?
Yeah, I've got another five. That's fine.
Perfect. Fantastic. I wanted to touch base quickly on omega 3s.
Okay.
I consume predominantly beef and lamb. Now, lamb is high in omega 3s, about 10 times more omega 3s in lamb fat than there is in beef fat. But omega 3s, are important. How important are they for the brain in regards to combating the amount of linoleic acid from the vegetable oils, which is an omega 6? Because these omega 6s can stay in the body for many, many years. I've seen some studies reference 2, and recently I saw a study referencing 5
Wow.
years, which is incredible. I do believe that we can offset this with
Mhm.
increasing the omega 3s.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of supplementation, which we can get
Yeah.
into if you want, but it's and for various reasons. But how important are the omega 3s? Should people be actively trying to put them in? Or
Yes. I think so. So in terms of the brain, it has a very high DHA content, which is one of the omega 3s. I forget the exact figures, but you might know off the top of your head. Um, and I, I didn't for a long time include seafood regularly. And I think there are some problems with seafood in terms of pollutants in the environment and microplastics and all of that. But I also think that omega-3, the DHA specifically, is so incredibly important for brain health that most people could be doing with getting more. And I agree that they shouldn't come from a supplement because polyunsaturated fats aren't stable, so they're not shelf stable. So all the fish oil supplements I would be wary of. And I know some have been tested and been shown to be oxidized or rancid. And also, I think just whenever we try to do things unnaturally and think that we're smarter as a human race, I think that's when things tend to go wrong. So I think just trying to choose whole food forms. So having ideally 2 portions of fatty fish in a week. Sometimes people find using salmon roe can be a really nice way of supplementing and a rich source of omega-3. And it's almost just like a supplement if you have a teaspoon. But again, it can get quite pricey. But mackerel, sardines, those kind of fattier fish, definitely. I tend to tell people to try to integrate into their diet if they
yeah,
can.
I agree. And mackerel is incredibly cheap, and it's a very good source of omega 3s. Again, I mean, you mentioned the microplastics and potential, hazard of pollutants, and I think that we can very much be caught up, in the minutia. And
Mm.
if we are living a ketogenic lifestyle, producing ketones, ketones increase glutathione, one of the body's master antioxidants. And this allows us, I believe, to combat, some of these. We are designed to combat these
Yeah.
stressors, and I think that the benefit from doing these things will outweigh, potential negative impacts. So I think that it's important to put these in if you are concerned. And some people can't eat fish, so if you are concerned with seafood or fish in general, then as you say, beef contains omega-3s, lamb contains high level of omega-3. So there are other ways that we can put
Yeah,
these in.
and grass-fed, grass-finished would be higher as well, is my understanding.
Yeah, spot on. And that's an important point because not all grass-fed beef is grass finished. This is
Mhm.
what another reason why I preference lamb. Lamb is always
Yeah.
grass-fed. Um, yeah, and it's a fantastic source of nutrients. I would argue that it's more beneficial than beef. Both are incredibly beneficial, and I mean it's neck and neck. But lamb, we had this conversation I think before we came on in regards to the availability, or did we have it during the call? I can't remember, but it's
I can't remember either.
but lamb, we're lucky in the UK because we have a very good source of lamb, and I think it doesn't predominate in the States. It's not one that is preferenced. So this is
Okay.
why the grass-fed beef, comes from the States where carnivore was sort of, that's what it predominates currently, isn't it? You see the likes of Dr. Chafee and Sean Baker, pushing out the carnivore lifestyle. Um,
Mhm.
and it's ribeye. I can't afford ribeye, so it's chuck steak for me, which is the end of the ribeye, by the way. And things like lamb. Now, lamb is highly accessible within the UK. So
Can
befriend
be more on the expensive side though as well,
it
I
can.
tend to find, but yeah.
Yeah, it can't. Yeah, and it depends, I think, on the cut and what you have and how much you buy. If you have a big freezer, then you can buy an awful lot in bulk. But it's even if we look at this, I think preference in animal proteins is going to be more beneficial. So even if you can't afford to go down the route of grass fed, grass finished,
Mhm.
um, any animal protein from any source is going to be more beneficial than
Yeah,
consuming the other compounds that we've just mentioned. Um,
great.
Brilliant. Rachel, have you got anything else to add to that? Look, I mean, this has been fantastic. I think, you and I could talk for another 3 hours about this and get
Yeah,
into depth in regards to these other pathways and things. But I mean, I'd love to get you back on to get into some of the science in regards to some
yeah,
of these things we've mentioned. But, as an introduction, I think that, the takeaways to this are lowering carbohydrate, reducing
yeah.
the seed oils, avoiding the grains, trying to gravitate towards a ketogenic lifestyle. All of these things are going to be beneficial for mental health, and this includes anxiety and depression. Um, and I agree. I think that gravitation towards a more animal-based way of living is going to be highly beneficial. And you've seen huge success, with
Yes.
your clients doing this,
Yeah.
which is incredible. So this is a real thing. This isn't
Oh yeah.
some. It's not
Yeah, I
some.
mean, I probably 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, I wouldn't have believed my eyes in terms of the transformations people can have, overcoming severe symptoms of mental illness. And my take-home message to people is just it's all about epigenetics. It's all about the our lifestyle choices and the environment and what how that influences how our genes are expressed. Because for so long we've been told it's all about genetics, but that's only one small piece of the puzzle. And actually, it's always been about nature versus nurture. So, and it's this nurture side that is within our power to change the ultimate outcome of our symptoms and health.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that yeah, the epigenetics is something I think we'll if you're willing to get on another call at some point in
Yeah.
the future, I'd love to get into that. But Rachel, it's been absolutely fantastic. Where can the listeners find you?
Oh gosh, so my website is rootcausepsych.com, or I'm on Instagram mostly and I'm carnivore shrink there.
Fantastic. Rachel, I'll pop all of those links below. It's been fantastic chatting. Thank you once again. Take care, and I will see you soon.
Thank you for having me.